Can start.
Yeah, we'll start. We'll just start. Hi, ma'am, and good evening, everyone who's here. On behalf of the entire team of Student Inclusion Cell of St. Xavier's, Mumbai, I'm Simran, and my co-host for the day is Manasi. And we would like to welcome you all to the webinar organized with Ms. Ankita Gujar on the topic Restructuring a Gender Fluid Society. Student Inclusion Cell is an official student body which focuses on inclusion in terms of gender, disabilities, linguistic and cultural diversity, etc. Before we begin, just a few instructions. It's a humble request to keep your mics and videos off during the session so as to not let in any disturbances. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box and Mansi will be posing them to ma'am at the end of her talk. If at any point you get locked out of the meeting and can't enter back in, you can always switch to our YouTube live stream. We will be sending a feedback form at the end of the session, upon whose filling you will receive your certificate for attending the webinar. Thank you for your cooperation, and we will begin now. So a little more about our speaker today. Our speaker for the day is Ms. Ankita Gujar. Ms. Ankita has been working in pedagogy since the last 9 years. She specializes in creative ludic pedagogies, social linguistics, feminism and expatriation, women's representation in media and popular culture. She's currently an assistant professor at St. Xavier's College Autonomous. She is also a qualified FFL educator and teaches French at the Alliance Francaise de Bombay. We are extremely honored to have you here, ma'am, and to hear you talk about this topic, which is something that, I'm pretty sure all of us have really racked our brains over. I have.
Yeah.
So I'm personally very excited for this, and over to you.
I'm glad. Okay, so because it's a topic that I'm so close to, I have a tendency to sort of talk a lot about it. I'm going to try to keep it to 40 minutes or 45 minutes so that we can have a conversation after that. But if I don't, please feel free to tell me, please, can you wrap up? Okay. Don't hesitate to tell me that because I will otherwise dawdle on. Anyway, without further ado, let's go on to the first sort of idea that I want to pitch in terms of trying to negotiate this idea of gender fluidity itself. Brings us to the question, a lot of us are confused between sex and gender. Okay. And to understand gender fluidity, you need to understand the concepts around what the LGBTQ movement is trying to negotiate. Okay. And we are determining the ideas of sex and gender through a little bit of science and society. Okay. So if you look at the scientific ideas of sex, on the right side of the screen of the PowerPoint, you can see there's strands of DNA and RNA, and then there's your the cellular structure which is there, and there's your heart and your lungs which are shown as well, and there's the sperm and the womb, okay, as symbols of that. So sex is basically a binary concept along which there's this one intersection that exists. You have male, female, so biologically determined male and female reproductive organs or sexual organs, and you have intersex, which means there's a mixing of those two organs that exist together. Okay, that is the idea of sex. It's biologically determined. Gender is, on the other hand, you keep seeing these new terms that come up and new terms that are used in whether it's blogs or news articles or influencers, or for that matter, academic writing. You'll see a lot of these terms like pansexual, bisexual is not a new term by any measure, but still, these terms that come up that determine how you perform. Cisgendered, okay, cisgendered heteronormative male or cis woman. What do these terms mean? Okay, these terms define or indicate how a person wants to socially construct their performance within a gender role. Okay, I might be biologically assigned the sex of a female. Okay, because the doctor, when he saw a child being born, determined that these particular parts fit a scientific anatomical structure of a female body. Okay, but at the same time, the way I perform my role, okay, is defined by a different term. It's not defined by woman. It's not defined by man. It's defined by something else. So I need to give a word to this something else. Okay. So on the left side of it, as you can see, there's There's one caricature of a man that's wearing presumably a man, okay, who has a mustache, who's extremely hyper masculinely mustachioed, okay, but at the same time he's wearing a skirt. Okay. Now, according to conventional, quote unquote, whatever that means, conventional gender norms, this is something of an aberrational performance. It's a new performance. It's something that maybe not new. New is not the right term to use, perhaps. It's something that does not fit into the public's gaze of what is a normal performance of gender. And as Michel Foucault would now ask the question, what is normal? Okay. Uh, there's a couple of drinks over there on the left side that you see of your screen. One is a pitcher of beer, and the other one is a margarita glass. Okay. If I were to ask you, which drink would you associate with gender, in a stereotypical notion, perhaps in popular parlance, in culture, and how beer is represented as a very masculine drink, as opposed to a cocktail being represented as a very effeminate drink, along with other adjectives that are associated with this, which brings us to pejorative terms like sissy or pansy or whatever it is. Okay, you'd have certain value connotations that are offered and associated to certain gender rules and norms. Okay. Um, if I were to ask you the question, there's a caricature of somebody holding a baby in their hand on the left side, if you see in that PPT. Okay. Um, what gender would you instinctively think that person is? Just a question out there. Okay, I know we're not in a space where we can interact too much. It's though it's a workshop, it's a little more the screen kind of disallows a little further interaction. So just think about these. Again, when you look at the shoes that are shown, there are two flat shoes which are there, and there's one sort of high heeled shoe which is there. Okay. Immediately, if I were to ask you, okay, put men and women into those shoes, there is a higher likelihood that you would normalize the performance of a female as wearing the woman's shoe. And I'm saying this again, you would normalize the performance of a woman as wearing the female shoe. Okay, sorry, the female as wearing the woman's shoe. Okay. And the moment I say the woman's shoe, a large part of you look towards the stiletto heel which was there. Okay. Which is what I mean by the sort of normalized, not normal, because normal is different. Normalized is constantly told to you through sort of indoctrination into a certain idea. Okay. You would presume that this particular person is associated with this kind of shoe. Okay. Accessorizing in fashion is one part of gender performance. A large part of it also fits into other kinds of roles that you perform. And could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so within this, we'll come back to gender roles. We're looking at a few other things. I've talked to you about biological sex. Okay, so that's what you fill out on most bureaucratic forms, which is male, female, and now you have the category of intersex also, which is indicated over there. Okay, a lot of social media websites will talk about sex and gender interchangeably. So when they give you like a list of now, as of today, as of my knowledge is concerned, we have about 58 gender performances. Okay, and those you have 58 genders that you can one of the 58 genders that you can tick off, and there are multiple terms that are associated with gendered performances. Okay, so you have androgen, you have cisnormative, you have transgendered. Okay, and you have of course the femme, the butch, in terms of certain other kinds of relationships. So that's your gender expression. Okay, that androgynous or whatever that is that you see, that's your gender expression. And with your gender expression, which is the adjectival form of how you perform your gender identity in society. Okay, and all of these, if you can see those four arrows which are there, these are end points. So there's woman and man on end points, and along this spectrum you have the other categories that exist as you go closer to woman or as you go closer to man. The question here is that very often we don't really have an idea of what is the ideal woman and what is the ideal man, because these are constant negotiations, these are constant fluctuations in how we behave. Okay. Personal example. Today I look a little more effeminate, whatever that means, because I have long hair. Throughout my college days, I had a pixie cut. Okay. So over there, my gender expression was something that was more androgynous, more between male and female. But now my gender expression seems to be more feminine. Okay. So gender expression is something that shifts in terms of how you dress, how you carry yourself, how you talk, how you actionalize your behavior within certain social situations. So gender expression is also socially constructed, gender identity is socially constructed. Okay. Let's come to the last category over there, which talks about. So I hope the first three are clear enough. Let's go on to talk about sexual orientation. Okay. Sexual orientation simply means with your gender expression, with your biological sex and your gender identity, who do you prefer as a partner? Okay. Who do you prefer as a partner for a relationship, a physical relationship? All right. In this situation, a heterosexual is somebody who likes a partner of the opposite sex. Okay, so me as a cisgendered heteronormative woman would like a cisgendered heteronormative male, okay, as my preferred partner or whatever it is. If I am homosexual, I would like as somebody who identifies as a woman, I would like another woman who also identifies as a lesbian. Okay, so this is just a way of negotiating who you want to have a physical relationship with, and there's also the sexual orientation of asexual, which means that you might love somebody but you might not want to have a sexual relationship with them or a physical relationship with them. Okay, and that is your orientation. Who are you oriented towards? Who do you like? Fair enough. All right, so these four categorizations are what the idea of gender fluidity is being negotiated through. Okay, the fact that while we have this polarization, this end spectrum, can the spectrum not be a circle where it encloses and it allows everybody to coexist along different patches, because we all navigate these lines very differently. So it's like this, basically this little circle that you're navigating within, in terms of your performance of gender, in terms of your choice of partner, in terms of who you fall in love with, in terms of who you don't want to have a physical relationship with. Okay, so all of these are navigational spaces along a circular sort of spectrum, more than this kind of binary that you've created, which is where the idea of the LGBTQ movement, LGBTQIA plus movement, challenging this idea of the binary and making this into a spectrum, an inclusive spectrum, comes about. Okay, so you have this idea of non-binary that comes about, saying that I don't want to be those two endpoints, I don't want to fall anywhere on those two endpoints, because that's not how I identify, that's now not how I feel comfortable. Okay, so coming to the next part, how does the LGBTQIA plus movement try to look at this intersectionality, look at this sort of how do people of different classes have different abilities to negotiate for more gender identity based performances as opposed to somebody else? There are three large spaces where this is sort of, actionalized. One is the social, the other is the political, and the third is the economic. Okay, so when you're looking at jobs, fairness of employment, fairness in employment, justice in the political space, and negotiation for civic rights. All right. So could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. All right. So this is just one of my all-time favorite actresses, Tilda Swinton. So on the left, top left image that you see, she has an angular face. Okay, now this is a mathematical observation rather than a personal one or whatever. She has an angular face and she has short hair. Okay, this is how she looks in most of her public appearances, or most of her whatever red carpet appearances, whatever you want to call it. Okay, on the right are the sort of films in which she has acted and the different roles she's played. Okay, and if you see in the first one, there's a slightly more sort of overt performance of so there's non-feminine characteristics that she has. In the second one, there's a little more longer hair with sunglasses, and she's with a partner of her choosing. And then there's, of course, the third image where she is supposedly playing the role of a villain. And you'll see the transformation that occurs, that the same person is able to be is able to embody different kinds of persons and give away different kinds of energies, a sort, for lack of a better term, in terms of being powerful, being masculine, being feminine, being what is it? So the idea is that her gender performance does not necessarily always indicate her ability to negotiate situations. Okay, and in all three, she plays an extremely powerful woman. Okay, so yeah, indeed. So just Vidushi, yes, I agree completely. Where asexuals also exist, of course, you can choose to not want sexual relations with a partner and still very much feel affinity to the relationship. So yeah. Okay, the next part that we come to is that the idea that the gender performance is fluid. Okay, you can be more masculine, more feminine at different points of time in terms of how you inhabit your being, and this is not always binary. And confining it to a binary is slightly problematic. Okay, could I have the next slide? Um, Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So thank you. So this is interesting. This was a very interesting exercise that I did while preparing for the PowerPoint presentation. And the first photo in the left corner is that of a guy with a beard. The reason I'm vocalizing this is because I know that not everybody has access to that PowerPoint presentation and its images. Okay, so I apologize if I'm not letting people describe the image in the chat box. I'm just doing it for you guys. Um, you'll see a guy who's bearded, who has a clearly muscular structure to his body, and perhaps also as a personal comment has questionable levels of hygiene because he looks like he's not showered for a few days, and he's wearing an olive green or what we call a military green t-shirt of some sort, and this is from a website that talked about the 10 personality traits of alpha males. Okay, the thing is, usually when we talk about men in common parlance, we have this idealized, objectified image of what a man's man should look like. This term, man's man, he's such a man's man. Okay, in Hindi parlance, you might have sachi mardangi as a concept. Okay, this idea of mardangi. The thing is, with these ideas, you have this fetishization, this idealization of how everybody should be, which means at any point of time that they are not adhering to that role as alphas or as hyper whatever characteristics that they want to belong to, they're considered less of what they are. Okay, and this is the kind of generational insecurity that has been built into how people think about themselves through their own bodies and their own performances of power and agency. Okay. Am I going too fast or is this comfortable enough for you guys? Uh, if I can have some yeses in the chat box because this feels extremely strange.
I can follow
Yeah,
quite.
okay. Okay,
quite
great,
fast.
great. All right, cool. Okay, thank you. So looking at the right is Wikipedia's first image that you get of alpha female. Okay. It's interesting to note that society would not be so comfortable with the alpha female being in existence. Okay. Another side to it is if you were to compare the ideas of Lara Croft Tomb Raider versus, say, Alia Bhatt in Razi. Okay, Alia Bhatt in Razi. Um, this idea of the badass woman is something that's always for some reason given by Occidental media as muscular, manly, okay, how do I say this, ripped in terms of muscle tone and this performance of power that happens. And it was interesting to note that Meghna Gulzar, when she spoke about Alia Bhatt, she said that I don't know why powerful women or women who take charge of situations or are alpha women are always represented in a male light. Okay, saying that women are as capable and as powerful of getting things done while still being or appearing delicate or while appearing womanly or small, or small in the sense of physical size. Okay, and one realizes that by situating certain adjectives, and language is extremely powerful, and language is the first technology of sorts. Okay, um, and when you define certain roles through certain linguistic terms, you end up limiting the scope of movement available to people to embody different ways of being. Okay, so for example, if I take a step back and I say, okay, I'm not going to negotiate this with force, but I'm going to negotiate this by using logical argumentation that's quite muted in that sense, I will immediately feel, oh, but I'm not being alpha enough in this world where I have to be like a powerful woman. Okay, and that's reducing my ability. That's rather being quite self-recriminatory in that sense, where I'm reducing my ability to negotiate that situation through a multitude of choices that I might otherwise have. Okay, so that's one part of sort of streamlining this idea of effeminate and masculine and mardangi, and this alpha male as the protector and the provider. It does not always have to be this idea of this combative, very combative male that is shown on the left side, or this very combative female. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so it's interesting that now, as we see a shift towards sort of what feminism is trying to do, there's also a part of feminism that looks at masculinity studies. Okay, that sees how men are impacted, how patriarchy as an institution also defines gender roles and gender performances and sexual orientations for who men ought to be. Okay, so here you have like these two very pop cultural examples that I've given of so on the right you have the sorry, on the left, the handsome achiever and the confident is the alpha male, and the timid, submissive and over caring is the beta male. Okay, and these terms like alpha and beta allow you to locate gender performances in a very stereotypical and limiting manner, okay, to what men should not be, which is problematic. Okay, because if it's just problematic in the sense that it's limiting their freedom and their choices available. So how do you, we come to the question, structure a society where you're allowed to be gender fluid, in the sense that you don't have to give that much value to these connotations, to these binary connotations of male, female, masculine, feminine. Okay, that you can move along this spectrum without being judged constantly for the choices that you make. All right, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I think, at least for me, I don't know if that's happening for you guys, but the woman's head has been cut off in the PowerPoint presentation. Is that happening with you guys as well, or can you see the entire picture?
I can see the complete image.
I can see the picture, yeah.
Oh, you can see the entire picture. Good, good, good. That's cool then. Then that's cool. Okay. No, I've logged in through my browser. So anyway, I'll just tell you the process that happened behind me finding these two pictures. Okay. The first one, I typed into Google search housewife, and I got that image, and I got a bunch of images like that. The moment I typed in the second thing, I got the second picture, which is the word that I typed in was homemaker. Okay, so one was housewife and the other was homemaker. It was not house husband. The term house husband for some reason still has negative connotations to it, and the term housewife still has a connotation of inferiority compared to provider or protector associated with it. So these are gender roles where, based on the physicality of your body, which means based on your sex and based on what gender role you want to fall into, you are slotted into certain terms and certain professions by society. Okay, and it's, in a sense, again, these sort of stereotypes flow into why the LGBTQIA plus movement is a challenge to these ideas of heteronormative binaries. Okay, so I hope the idea of heteronormative, this big term hetero and normative together, is clear enough. Okay, so the next part that we come to is, how do we negotiate these choices that we need to make? How do we mobilize certain choices in a few other spaces? The fight for civic rights, one of the first rights to be negotiated was the right to now currently that we look at 377, the decriminalization of homosexual relationships. Okay, it's interesting because in a lot of societies, and this is not just India, okay, but in a lot of societies, you always have this conversation: don't wash your dirty laundry in public. It's a domestic space ka issue. If it's a domestic space ka issue, then it should not be aired out in public. And yet, when the idea of a relationship with any kind of partner, whether it's a same sex partner or a similarly gendered partner, is brought into is brought up, why would you then criminalize any activity that is taking place in the domestic space? Okay, that's one question. So if it's your quote unquote dirty laundry, why are you forcing people to air it in public? Okay, or why are you criminalizing it in public? So that's an interesting sort of negotiation that happens on why bring criminality into something that is a domestic space dispute when you've not brought criminality into the idea of marital rape, okay, which is still permissible in India. So after we sort of undo these value laden terms like emasculation or asli madangi or sachi madangi and all of that, we have to undo who has better access or who has more equitable access to institutions of marriage which allow for some amount of stability in relationships to come about. We are looking at political representation and therefore elected representatives of people being from multiple genders and multiple sexes as well. um, and we are also looking at how does your sexual orientation or your choice of gender affect your ability to do your job efficiently. Okay, so now in terms of women's rights, this has always been negotiated with women have children and therefore then they'll kind of not focus on their jobs and blah blah blah. But it's also a space where effeminate men and hypermasculine women or alpha women are sort of discriminated against. So when you build sensitization towards these value laden, socially constructed, problematic terms, you're undoing that sort of desensitized society that people live in, where they'll push throwaway comments in people's faces about, whatever it is. So, could I have the next slide, please? Okay. So, in civic rights, at towards the bottom, what you see is a cisgender heteronormative couple. Okay. Just a request to keep the chat box clean of expletives, please. Okay. So, by the way, I don't know who's writing it. I can just see like some messages pop up from time to time. So, apologies for that. So, it's a cisgender heteronormative couple, which is there. Okay. A man and a woman who've gone to town hall, signed their marriage certificate, and come back out. Okay. This is something that I'm going to take up historically. The top right corner is the whole piggyback ride thing that we all do as kids with each other, I suppose. Okay, but this is between two consenting male adults. Okay, and it displays some sort of affinity in terms of a romantic relationship. Okay, um, there are two incidences that I want to sort of talk about when it comes to this idea of civic rights to relationships itself, okay, and to the idea of love and affection. Okay, uh, in the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up, and my sort of parents would talk about HIV/AIDS or whatever it is, they always sort of I was always told with like extended family and all of that, it was a gay man's disease. Okay, and one of the ways to express that this was gay man's disease, this was a gay man's disease, problematic terminology again, was to say that because they are in quote unquote non-normal relationships, and therefore their partnerships switch more frequently, and therefore they have multiple partners, and which is why they have a higher risk of getting infected. Okay, higher rates of infection in vulnerable populations across the heteronormative spectrum also exist, including prostitution, including truck drivers, including a lot of migrant professions. Okay, people who move across cities and have to leave their families behind. Okay, and as much as heteronormative relationships could include infidelity, there's a higher risk of getting infected as well. But at the same time, it got labeled as a gay man's disease. Okay, One of the ways in which the right to marriage and the right to civic union is negotiated is that if you want these people to have security of life, non vulnerability to certain diseases that they're categorized into, then you have to give them the right to access those kinds of institutionalizings of relationships. Okay, you need to have institutionalized relationships for them to be able to move into that secure space, to say that yes, they have access, they have a right to institutionalized forms of love, marriage, civic union, partnerships, cohabitation. All of that should be legitimized for them, because that will give them the security to now move across different partners, so that slowly it will get normalized in the eyes of society. The less censure they have from society about this, supported by courts of law, of course, which are going to look at principles of justice, you would have them leading happier lives. Okay, happier lives, lower stress means also means the ability to combat certain diseases better. Okay, so they need institutional protection. That's one space where this begins. Another thing is also this idea of this idea of fertility and the idea of being able to have children. Who has the right to have children? Is it only heteronormative couples who are in happy or unhappy marriages that often have children, or can a well-adjusted, not just well-adjusted, but any kind of person who wants the right to reproduce should have the right to reproduce? Okay, now whether that's with the same-sex partner or with another sort of cisgendered partner is another story altogether. Okay, so we're looking at this idea of what kind of civic rights allow for a happier sort of society to emerge. Okay, and be inclusive across different performances of gender. Okay, and a rights-based approach ensures that these people have the protection of the law, even if society's mentality hasn't changed in that process or up to that point. Okay, so another sort of interesting conversation that I had with a friend of mine was this. She'd gone to the Pride parade in Delhi and she'd taken pictures of that. And somebody asked her, "Why do you guys have to be so loud about all these relationships and this kind of drama that you do in the public space and whatnot?" And she literally just replied with posters of every single romantic film that has ever been shown on television. All of them pink, blue sky, glaringly pastel colors, with one cisgendered man and one cisgendered woman on the poster. Okay, she said, when you look at normativity, right, when you look at something that has been normalized in the public gaze, you don't understand that something else is being sidelined or being marginalized. When you see so many posters of heteronormative films all the time, how do you think any gay person feels when they're looking at that poster going like, I feel so out of this? Like, why do these straight people have to be so loud about their romance and their PDA all the time? Okay, so that's an interesting take that she had, in terms of like, that's an interesting response she had to that, and I felt it was important that I bring that up in this talk. Just give me a second. It's just gotten a little cloudy here. So okay, so could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a Indian civic union, or rather an Indian marriage between two gay men. But this is in the US, because India has not legalized same-sex marriages yet, though it has decriminalized same-sex relationships. So just something to think about, in the sense that if we celebrate this as institutionalized happiness, if people look at this as something that is an institutional achievement in life, it's one of those markers कि अच्छा उसकी ना शादी हो चुकी है, and one of the non achievement markers है अरे वो 30 साल की हो गई 25 like whatever 25 years की हो गई 35 years की हो गई, he's still single or he's still single. Okay, of course different connotations to bachelorhood and spinsterhood across the spectrum of man and woman also, but if you're saying that a civic union legitimized by society and by law is a parameter of achievement, okay, then why are you legally denying that to same sex persons and marriages? Okay, that's one of the arguments to put forth. All right, so talking about the next sort of step that we come to in the rights-based discourse, let's talk about this idea of I wanted to talk about media representation. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so sorry, I forgot about this part. Political representation. Um, Understandably, we do have a 33% reservation for women in parliament. In 2015, for the first time, a transgender person by the name Madhu Kenar was elected as mayor of Raigad. Okay, it's a city about, I think, about 400 to 500 kilometers northwest of West Bengal. Okay, and this is an important step because political representation brings to light the idea that just this vision of gender that we have, just this vision of the two sexes that we have, is not the only way to think about reality. And representation is one of the first steps to negotiating change. Okay, so which is why it is so important to offer and have that kind of representation and to make this visible to people as well. Of course, the moment it is made visible to people, those who are in a position where status quo of power is preferable to them will get extremely uncomfortable, and they'll start asking questions like, but why do you need to do all this? Okay, but it's important that we take that step. And so imagine in a country where the entire hijra community is celebrated for the sort of good luck that they bring to communities in terms of weddings and children being born and all of that. For the first time in 2015, we had political representation in independent India being given to a transgender person. Okay, now a trans person is not a term that we use without the consent of that person wanting to be called that. Okay, that's something to be kept in mind when we say that. So the next slide, please. Okay, so on the left, if I were to tell you, just analyze only the image on the left, you'll see that this is an extremely muscular male wearing ripped jeans, fitted ripped jeans, has a relatively fit body, is wearing sneakers, and is topless. Okay, and has short hair. Okay, um, the same person, so this is a model and a dancer by the name of Connor Mackenzie. Okay, and he's also a ballet dancer of sorts. He's also a contemporary dancer and a ballet dancer of sorts. On the right, what you see is him at one of his so-called performances. Okay, or preparations for a performance rather. The same person can feel the need to embody a different gender role at different points in time. Now, the arts have always been a space to do that. Whether it's dance, it's through literature, it's through cinema and representation. So, you need better and more holistic representation that does not confine people to these sort of streamlined binary sort of ideas where this person on the left has to consistently be that way in every single advertising campaign, or this person this way has to be exactly like this even in his personal life. The thing is, he can embody many ways of being. So he's a very interesting person to follow on Instagram if you just want to check how gender fluidity works in terms of everyday performances. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. So going by just this image, okay, I'm presuming that with the bespectacled man on the left side and with his shaved head or perhaps bald head, whatever you want to call it, okay. Let's talk about this person. You would say he's presumably a man who's performing his role as a man as well. He's in a t-shirt. On the right, you see like a slight transformation in terms of glaring colors and whatnot, and immediately your mind might associate certain adjectives with it. Very flamboyant, very colorful, whatever adjectives you want to put across. Okay, and immediately your mind would also stereotype him into certain performances of perhaps he works for the fashion industry, or he's a magazine editor, or something of that sort. Like a I don't know, like a fashion magazine editor or something of that sort. And there's been stereotypical representations of people in media who look a certain way. How do we move beyond these? Okay, the third image that you see is also that of, so both of these guys, they're named Brian. Okay, one is the guy on the left is I forgot his surname, Brian F something. Okay, his surname starts with F. On the right is Brian McCook. Okay, and the next image, please. Okay, sorry, one more after that. I'll come back to this one. I think the slide order got messed up. Okay, and these are their drag characters. So those two Brians that you saw, These are their drag characters. So the reason drag as a performance exists is, if you see on the left is Brian, I think Furkis or Furkis or something like that. Okay, and the other one is Brian McCook on the right. Their drag performance names are the drag queen names are Trixie Mattel and Katya. Okay, they were a part of RuPaul's Drag Race. Um, the idea of drag, what Judith Butler says, is to exaggerate the performances of what it is to be male and female. So you have drag kings and drag queens. Drag queens exaggerate the performance of what it is to be female to show how exaggeration of these characteristics and idealization of these characteristics of being male and female is problematic, time consuming, and at the same time idealized and fetishized. Okay, so the amount of effort that it takes to get into the form of a female for somebody who's close enough to being a male or is a male is extremely difficult. So now let's go back to the previous slide, the one with the, yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry for whoever has to do this the moment I say this. Usually it would be me doing this. I would be, yeah, I feel really bad delegating this. Okay, so if you see, there's a before and after image of lip and chin hair, and there's so many advertisements like this that will bombard your faces every single time you go to a railway station, every time you're traveling in a train, every time you open social media, and every time you open a newspaper. Okay, in the 90s, the late 90s and early 2000s, when all these hair loss clinics were coming up, you'd always have this image of that bald man going for like a treatment, or this woman with facial hair going for laser treatments. Okay, uh, so it's interesting to see that what drag is doing is saying exaggerating this idea of womanhood and manhood takes a lot of effort, consumes a lot of time, and involves a lot of resources, monetary and otherwise, mental resources as well. So when society is insecure about your performance of gender, okay, it imposes and creates institutions around that to ensure you fit into that profile of gender representation. One of them being these before and after pictures, and the technologies, the medical technologies or whatever it is, that are used to ensure that you fit into these performances. Okay, in a way it is an institutionalized doctrine of knowledge taking charge of your body and how you live within that body as well. Okay, and gender fluidity, restructuring society by undoing all these stereotypical ideas that we have of what is that binary performance, is about undoing how much of an influence these institutions have on your life, whether that is the state through its regressive laws on marriage and civic unions, whether it is of political representation and not allowing loud trans persons to be a part of the public sphere, and I say that in quotes because it's a problematic concept, and disallowing men from having no hair, and disallowing women from having slight amounts of facial hair. Okay, so could I have the slide after the drag queens, please? Two slides ahead, I'm guessing. Yes, perfect. So here, what we're looking at is how, there's always been these problems in terms of why are people putting up she, her, or we, us, or they, them on social media right after their names, and this is something that's as a trend that's emerging that you'll see. One of the reasons for those 58 genders to exist and to claim them as identities, one of the ways of creating new vocabulary. Remember that Shakespeare created new words wherever he wanted to, and he felt that vocabulary was inadequate to express reality. So, in a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis kind of sense, you have to generate new words to be able to embody new realities in life. Okay, if we are shifting towards a more gender inclusive reality, what we need to do is have the language to tell more powerful stories and to create more narratives and to explain those and to allow for them to exist. Okay, so in a sense, these claims to language, these claims to new words are also ways and means of empowering, acquiring language as a tool to fight against systemic prejudice that exists. Okay, so it's something that has happened in other ways of navigating inclusion. When we talk about mental health, okay, in the 60s and 70s, saying somebody is MR, mentally retarded, okay, as a pejorative term was extremely common. Okay, but now you have to be more careful about how you negotiate that term. You have more sensitive and diverse vocabulary that exists to address very specific issues which have their own layers and nuances to them. Okay, the same way that somehow through the 80s and 90s, the idea of blind becomes visually challenged because you're including a spectrum of analysis into that. A percentage of physical sort of disorder versus what works, what does not work. Which is why even within the LGBTQ spectrum, and this is not, I mean, it's like comparing apples and oranges, which is not really true because you're talking about physical and sort of gender inclusion on the same spectrum. It's a little problematic. But the equivalence that I'm trying to draw is that you need better ways of expressing to normalize things in discourse and to include ways and layered meanings of reality in discourse itself. Okay, so being aware that I was comparing apples and oranges and then moving away from that back to the idea of the narrative, gender inclusion and linguistic inclusion, it's one way of writing newer stories, including better narratives. And if you guys want to check out more resources, Skin Stories by, if I'm not mistaken, Skin Stories by Point of View and Agents of Ishq as an institution, as an organization on Instagram are beautiful places to start looking at newer ways of talking about love, civic action, political representation for queer persons. So with that, I think I've gone 9 minutes beyond the allotted time for my talking, if I'm not mistaken. So hopefully this has been, yeah, timed well enough. And I am now open to taking on questions. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am, for keeping us engaged for so long. That was a beautiful talk. We should be moving on to our Q&A part of the session now. A few instructions before we start. Please make sure that the questions are sent in only through the chat. And please don't try to unmute yourselves, only through the chat. And I'll be reading the questions out loud to ma'am as and when they keep coming in. To allow the audience some time to think over their questions.
Manasi, are you there? I think she's frozen.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just give her a minute. Otherwise, I'll continue with the questions.
Sure thing. The last image, by the way, of the PPT, you don't have to start the PPT, and it's not required. The last image of the PPT was from the 2018 Delhi Pride parade that happened. So, yep, just in case you wanted, with the full flag of the colors and, yeah, the Pride flag and all of that.
I think Mansi got locked out, so I'll just continue with the questions and we'll take up a few more from the chat box. Mansi and I had decided on a few questions that we wanted to ask you because we knew that this thing was going to be really cool, so we came prepared.
That's a lot of faith and trust for some reason. That's cool, yeah.
Okay, so one of the few things that, I mean, you did address it in your talk, but something that I was thinking about as well was one of the ways that we could potentially do away with gender fluidity, do away with binaries of gender would be through marriage, through the institution of marriage, because that is where I feel, I mean, that's where the binaries get set in stone. So how do you think, what implications do you think that will have on the entire institution of marriage if we come to a point where we can be gender fluid and be proud about it?
I think it's positive. See, the thing is, giving somebody else rights to a civic institution like that does not take away your negotiation of it. I mean, it's not exactly like, understand that marriage, coming from a single person, of course, talking about this, it's not an ideal institution. I mean, we've all seen people around us have problematic marriages, at the same time have excellent marriages. Okay, it's an institution that is negotiated at every level, okay, on an everyday basis. So there is no harm in making this sort of a universalized concept where it's an institution that remains accessible to everybody. Okay, because you can't have it both ways, where you say that whatever is in the domestic space, don't air it in public. And then also heteronormative people who lay claims to the fact that if gay people are allowed to get married, then my ability to negotiate my own marriage is troubled, which just confuses me to no end, because how? Like, how does it become less sacred for anybody if you are the sort who believes in the institution of marriage altogether? So yeah, okay.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one more question would be, do you think society as a structure could ever be completely inclusive of gender fluidity, considering the administrative implications of that, like the complications that might come with it? How do you maneuver through that?
So, okay, so this is a slightly more complex question that I would like to address through a more historical approach and a more sort of navigating it through history and right now, okay? Um, so I think we kind of are aware to a certain extent that the somewhat colonial Victorian morality imposed by the British in terms of the segregation and the separation of men's roles and women's roles, then of course brought about by the whole neo-imperialism of the 1940s, 1950s American ideal of the homemaker, the housewife, and the alpha male executive who went out and worked for a Fortune 500 company or whatever it is, was something that consolidated these ideas of gender roles as we see them today. Okay, consolidated over the last 60, 70 years. And when we kind of rescinded the Article 377 and we kind of decriminalized homosexuality, one of the ideas that was circulating was that this is India decolonizing, where we're sort of going away from the colonial ideals of separation of man and woman as two separate entities and all of that, because throughout our literature there's always been a presence of multiple gender identities, and that fluidity has had always existed. The problem there is also we tend to idealize the past as something that was very beautiful and non-gory and very non-confrontational, non-conflicted, and all of that. So, but at the same time, what we're doing is, whether we reclaim or whether we set new steps in place to achieve equity, okay, the negotiation is a constant one. It needs to happen on an everyday basis with the ideas of justice as fairness. And therein you have these three areas where education in terms of sensitizing people about gender fluidity, part one. Then the law, which is going to allow for legalizing certain social institutions around these sort of negotiations that need to happen through marriage, through civic unions. Okay, and thirdly, political representation. So the personal is political in that sense, and it always has been. And that's something that we need to sort of engage with. And whether this includes getting to the streets and fighting for it, or it means over 20 years of 2 or 3 court cases and consistently setting judicial precedents in place to allow us to kind of create better laws around the multiplicity of genders that are allowed to negotiate certain rights. A rights-based discourse would help enormously in that regard. So yeah.
Ma'am, if we could just start with one of the questions on the team side.
Yeah.
The question goes, can society as a structure ever be truly inclusive of gender fluidity?
Manasi, we asked her that.
My bad. I move on to the next one.
You can ask her about some of the last ones that we had, since I asked the first 2 ones.
All right. The next question would be, referring to the biological physicality approach being reductionist, how can we maneuver between what might be considered accurate on one hand and reductionist on the other? And then what are the implications for the same?
So when you're talking about, say, the biological approach being reductionist in that sense, Judith the Butler does talk about that in Gender Trouble. Okay, she is saying that not only is gender a spectrum, but sex is also a spectrum, because everybody's physical body parts of reproduction are different from somebody else's. Okay, so at the level of medical institutionalizing, you need far more research that happens into differently abled bodies as well and differently structured bodies as well. Medical trials need to be inclusive of this diversity when it comes to bringing new medicines into the market, or looking at sort of disabilities and diseases impacting certain target groups differently. Okay, and there needs to be more diversity in medical research with that in that regard as well. So that will allow for this, the reductionism that scientific streams often get into, this aggressive objectivism without taking into consideration human variables at times, including these aberrations. Anything, the structural binary itself, and this comes from sort of Enlightenment philosophy when we talk about uh, what if you have a normative, then you have a non-normative automatically. You don't have something that is half normal and half non-normative. For some reason, you always go to the opposite extreme of what it is, and this sort of dualism that we fall prey to is something that medical science needs to undo, to kind of move away from this idea, this concretized binary of biological sex, and look at different spectrums of analysis in the physicality of sex itself.
Ma'am, maybe I can start with a couple. One that was sent to me privately is, does sexual orientation always involve biological aspects? Like being bisexual and not being bisexual would constitute a biological component or not?
No, so bisexuality is choosing a partner from either the male or the man or the woman. Okay, so as a woman, if I were to be bisexual, I'd be okay with having physical relations with a man and a woman. I'd feel attracted to both. Okay, so sexual orientation is about attraction. Asexual means that you don't have any attraction. Sexual orientation is about attraction, not about the physicality of the sex. Okay, which means it's not the biological assigned male, female, or intersex persons. Yeah, it does not always have to be associated with that.
The next question, even today, we are filling forms, we find only two gender options, male or female. Talking of educational forms, do we really need to specify a gender, that to a limited gender? Shouldn't education be gender fluid too?
Absolutely. So there are smaller spaces that have started with the third, at least the third sex being mentioned, where there is intersex as a category that exists. I think it takes time, and it takes at times decades for movements like this to percolate into everyday normalizing. Okay, so this idea of normalizing what was constituted earlier on as non-normal or non-normative takes years and years of negotiation and effort. So social media is a space where this has started. In terms of, I know Facebook for a fact has, like, I think, a list of about 40 genders that you can choose from. I don't know if they've increased this over the last year or so, but anyway. So it starts from there, and then it goes on to sort of other spaces. So it percolates down, so to speak. So yeah, I hope that responds to your question adequately. But it's also constant negotiations. Bring these issues to light. Work through legal scenarios on this. Engage in public discourse. Sensitize people, and slowly and eventually systems change. But systems change because people within them negotiate for that change constantly and consistently. And oftentimes it's a matter of sort of, two steps ahead, one step back, and it's yeah, it's how you move.
The next question in chat is, how to approach and help a person who is facing gender dysphoria?
I'm not a counselor. I am not qualified to respond to that question. So if I may skip that, I would be comfortable with that, because if I'm not qualified to respond to something like that in terms of how to help, and because you're saying this dysphoria is something that is categorically something that requires a lot of sensitivity, and allow the most I can say is allow them to define who they are, and give them the space and the security net to define who they are, instead of vocalizing your opinions about that towards them. Just accept them for who they are, in that sense, that at some level, while it's an important part of them negotiating their identity, reassure them that the worth they have as an individual is not defined or limited only to that one aspect of being. So just as any, because if gender is a performance, it's the performance of one of multiple roles. Okay, so if you are defined only by, say, because I'm speaking to Mansi now, if you are defined only by your role as a student in life, okay, you would feel quite stifled by the fact that your only role in life is to be a student, which it is not. Okay. Or for that matter, you were not made into a student and your only role in life is to be a daughter. That singular role does not constitute your value as an individual. You are a sum of multiple parts and roles that you play. Okay. And you're better and bigger than that. So, yeah. I think just acknowledging that, but at the level of everyday negotiation, I cannot individually counsel you to do that because not qualified. Sorry. Yeah.
I think there's a very basic question in chat. I think we should address that first. It says, what does non-binary mean?
Non-binary means you're not falling on either ends of the spectrum. You're not on the extreme ends of the spectrum. You're along the spectrum somewhere where you don't identify with the end points of it. I hope that makes sense as a response. Okay. Yeah.
The next question is, how do we remove the stigma around gendered clothing, that specific clothes are for specific genders, and that needs to be normalized that clothes have no gender?
So this was really interesting as an exercise. I remember Sachit Puranik, who is a former Xavierite, and he is now theatre director. He sort of performed this play based on Shilpa Phadke's work called Why Loiter. Okay, so Shilpa Phadke has written the book Why Loiter, and Sachit's play is based on that. And throughout the play, what he did was he was wearing a dress in that play. Okay, if Sachit is watching this and I've given away some state secret, I'm sorry, but yeah, okay. So at the end of it, nobody felt like it was an aberrational thing that he was wearing a dress on stage. It was consistent. And then you normalize the same way that perhaps Black Panther as a film normalized the idea of a black person being on screen. Representation, constant representation of this is something that allows for that shift to occur, that normalizing to occur. So just as it is now normal to see women wearing jeans, Coco Chanel was one of the first women in the 1920s who came up with the power suit for women, the pantsuit for women as well, like the idea of pants for women. Okay, and from the 1920s to 2020s, the idea of a pant worn by a woman has become normalized somewhere, right? So it's taken 100, it's not taken 100 years. This was very, very normal about 40, 50 years ago as well, 30, 40 years ago. Okay, maybe not 60, 70 years ago, but 30, 40 years ago, I know since I've grown up that the idea of a woman wearing a pant in a public space in urban spaces is quite normal. Okay, so this, or for that matter, seeing somebody wearing jeans and Xavier's is extremely normal. Okay, so you normalize it by making it physically more representative. So yeah.
Ma'am, maybe we'll take in the last question, which sort of ties up with a question that was asked by the team too. This is by Gayatri. Sweden is known for having families that raise their children in a gender fluid manner. They also have schools that do not categorize students as girls or boys. However, there is a lot of debate about this. What are your views on raising children without introducing them to gender? And it ties up with a question from the team side, which basically goes, how far do you think parental guidance should go in helping children navigate their gender identity, if at all?
So there is an element of privilege to this, okay, where you're talking about Sweden, which is a country which ranks high on the equality indexes across multiple studies that are conducted. Okay, another thing is also in a space where you are even cognizant of the idea of gender fluidity as something that you need to teach your kids about. You're looking at the fact that you have backup systems in place that ensure that the mental health of a child going out into a society that has not adjusted to the ideas of gender fluidity entirely, okay, and is likely to be bullied and is likely to be raised in a non-sensitive environment in the outer space, outer social institutions, as opposed to your primary group of socialization, which is the family. If you can negotiate that and if you can assure that, you're already in a position of relative privilege. So it is possible for a few select individuals to apply explicitly those labels, okay, but understand that gender fluidity can exist without really needing those labels as well. Okay, that you don't have to make a conscious decision to raise a child as a gender fluid person. They can just be gender fluid without you imposing that discourse as well on their performance, particularly if you're not cognizant of the terminologies around it. Just accept the child for whatever they want to wear or what they want to listen to, or how they want to dance, or what kind of performance of dance that they want to engage in. Okay, so it's, I mean, I'm just using these reductionist categories again to explain that point, but yeah.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
ma'am. I think we will have to be wrapping up the sessions considering the time constraint. Uh,
Okay.
Thank you so much for that beautiful talk. Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm pretty
Thank you
sure
a lot
each
for
one of
having me
us
here.
will have a lot to ponder over once we close. Thank you
Indeed.
to our audience for being so interactive, so patient, and putting up with all of our technical glitches, personally mine. And thank you to Keshav sir for handling our logistics for both the Zoom call and the YouTube live stream. And lastly, thank you to the rest of the SIC team for helping put the event together. I request the audience members if you could please turn on your camera so that the SIC team could just get a screenshot for our Instagram feed, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me over. It was just a pleasure doing this.
Big smiles, everyone. I think we should have gotten that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like,
Also,
thank you so much for handling the PowerPoint presentation and for dealing with the technical glitch from my end where Zoom wasn't working. So, thanks a lot, Keshav sir. So yeah.
also